name is Darcy, and I'm here to speak to you today a little bit about expanding into Greenland. As part of that, I'm going to talk to you about some of the social customs, value systems, political patterns, economic institutions, and environmental concerns for Greenland. So let's start with the social customs. Greenlanders tend to be a very friendly people. They tend to also be slightly more reserved, and their strong sense of etiquette is derived from their Inuit culture. So they tend to be friendly but reserved, which means, handshakes are appropriate. Hugs are not unless they're family. Talking about appropriate dress, usually business casual is the primary form of dress. So as you can see, business casual. Try not to go formal, and casual is probably not the best. Don't show up in jeans. It's a foreign country. They speak Greenlandic, and a lot of them speak Danish. English may be spoken, but I would not depend upon that. In the Inuit communities, gender lines are still very firm. Men tend to be the hunters and the gatherers and the fishermen, and the women tend to stay at home and take care of the families and clean and preserve the meats that the men bring home. So now that we've talked about, let's look a little bit at value systems. How are Americans perceived? Greenland, Denmark, and the U.S. have had a collaboration on issues of healthcare, technology, science, tourism, things like that. So Americans tend to be fairly welcome. They're not shunned by the local population, since there is a working relationship between our governments. When you talk about education, the children in Greenland go to school just like our children do, but the parents are not very involved. The parents tend to not push their kids, so if the kids don't feel like going to school, they don't go to school. Education is not a priority to these people for the most part. There is one university, it's called Greenland University, but for the most part, if people want to continue their education, they have to go overseas. Generally, they go to Denmark, since it is, their sister country. So now that we've looked at that a little bit, let's talk about political patterns. Until 1953, Denmark was considered a colony, or Greenland was considered a colony of Denmark. As part of that, while Greenland now takes care of most of their internal affairs, Denmark is still responsible for most of their foreign policies. So Denmark tends to look after things like the military, foreign policy, as well as finances. There has been talk about Greenland separating and making its own sovereign country, but at this point there is no push for that. It's a fairly small population, and Denmark does so much work for them. They get so much subsidies from Denmark. It would not be in the country's best interest at this time to separate. So it doesn't look like that's anything that's going to happen in the near future. So now let's look at economic institutions. Tourism is not very big in Greenland. There aren't a lot of direct flights. There's a short season for tourism due to the weather, so it's not huge. Take into consideration also that there are only 3 roads connecting cities on the island, and one of those cities was abandoned in the 1980s. So travel is usually done, when you're looking outside of the cities, it's usually done by ATV or dog sled. Denmark depends a lot on its exports, which, if you look here, pretty much all of this is from fishing. They get a lot of exports from their fishing industry, and that's how they make a majority of their revenue that isn't subsidized by Denmark. Also, they use the Danish kroner as their main form of currency, and that is pretty stable. Over the last 5 years, it has not fluctuated more than 1 Danish kroner per each US dollar. So it hovers around 5 and 6 Danish kroner per each US dollar, which makes it relatively stable. Now let's talk about environmental concerns. It's an island, and it's not green. Even though it says Greenland in the name. It is mostly covered in ice. The only place you're going to find land is around the coast, and that is mostly sort of a mountainous region, especially on the north side. Most of the towns are centered right down here in this area. And part of that is because, as you can see here, most of Greenland is in the Arctic Circle. Only that small portion in the south is not part of the Arctic Circle. So it gets really, really cold there. The warmest temperatures it sees in the south is usually around 68 degrees. In the north, it's usually about 50. In the winter, it can get, the average temperature is around -4 towards the north and 18 in the south. So it's pretty cold. Also, considering how close it is to the Arctic Circle, it spends a lot of time in those extreme day and night phases. It spends pretty much, especially in the north, three months of complete darkness. And then there are also 3 months of pretty much perpetual day. That can be really difficult to adapt to and to work with, since it's not something that we're used to. You also have to take into consideration the indigenous wildlife. We want to keep our eye out for any endangered species or anything like that, and there are several. Mostly they tend to be birds and fish. If you also look here, take into consideration that there are carnivorous mammals that live there, large carnivorous animals like the polar bear, which encounters with them can be fatal. So now that we've spoken about all of those things, we've looked at some of the social customs, some of the value systems, political patterns, economic institutions, things like that, I'd like to bring you to my conclusion. And my conclusion is that given all of these considerations, even though it's a fairly harsh climate and the people tend to be very traditional, they're also very casual and they are very friendly, and they are willing to work with you. They are politically and economically stable. As long as there is no major upheaval, there should be no reason not to expand into Greenland. I know we went through all that information really fast, so if anybody has any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them.